Hello, and welcome to the Student Ministry Conversations podcast with your hosts, Brent Aiken, David Pruitt, and Russell Martin. This podcast is all about equipping, encouraging, and inspiring youth pastors weekly with topics that are brought to the table by youth pastors from all over the world. And now, here's your host for this week, Brent Aiken. Hey, and welcome to the podcast. If this is your first time listening to us, we want to welcome you and invite you over to our website, studentministryconversations.org, where you can find all of our previous episodes, show notes, and blog articles. Our goal is that you're inspired, encouraged, and the things that you hear on this podcast can equip you to be a better student pastor for the church that you're serving in. Today, we have the honor of sitting down with Brad Griffin again. He is a recurring guest as we've started to have on our show a couple times now, but we're excited because last time Brad was on the show, he had a book, and Brad, this time we're talking about another book, which I'm excited about because we are literally recording it on release week, and so this episode's going to come out next week or the week after, but I'm actually recording this with you as this is the release week. So exciting stuff, man. First off, congratulations. But what is the book? And just tell us a little bit more about it, more about you for listeners that didn't maybe hear your first episode and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks, Brent. It's great to be back. I like that recurring guest. We could make that a theme. It's really fun. And I am excited to be talking about this content. Yeah, we do have a new book. It's called Faith Beyond Youth Group. And one of the things I love, Brent, is when I say that title, people kind of perk up and are intrigued. And I'm glad because I think it's exactly the kind of conversation we need to be having. It comes out of research we've been doing at the Fuller Youth Institute. So that's where I serve. I do live in Southern California and serve at the Fuller Youth Institute California office. And I also serve in my local church, working with students as a volunteer and volunteer pastor. And I have 3 teenagers and young adults in my home. So I think about this stuff from all levels, kind of all the time, wearing my research hat here at FYI and working with a lot of youth and student ministry leaders across the country. And then also just really, really practically and locally trying to figure out what this looks like on the ground. So I'm excited for this conversation.
Yeah, no, and it is something that's really, really cool. And if you're watching us on YouTube, Brad does have a copy of the book way back in the back on his bookshelf. But if you haven't seen it, that is the book right there, Faith Beyond Youth Group. And we're going to dive into this as the conversation today because I don't think, and I was reading some of the kind of quotes that you had from big names in youth ministry, and Doug Fields caught my eye because he said this book, like you said a second ago, had me at the title. Because he's like, it's what we all want, hope, and pray for, a faith that matters long after our games, teaching, camps, and programs are over. And man, if there's a testament to youth ministry, I think that's the desire for all of us. Being, whether you've been in youth ministry for a year or whether you've been in a youth ministry and you're a veteran and serving 20 years plus, it is something that we all strive for. I guess the first question I'd have to ask though is, why is this something that we strive for? Why is this something so important for us to talk about?
Yeah, well, you're right that we all long for that. And I think, too, it's an open secret that youth ministry needs to change. This was true before COVID, and the pandemic really exposed and, sped up, accelerated all that was outdated and ineffective about youth ministry. So I started youth ministry in the mid-90s, shortly after high school. And a lot's changed since then. Young people have changed, society's changed, but the ways we do youth ministry in some cases still look a lot like 1999. And that's a problem because the student ministry of the 90s doesn't work as well today as it used to. We can't just plan big, fun programs and count on a bunch of students showing up. Sometimes that works, and in some settings that works, and others are just feeling like they're failing, and not because they don't care, and but because we're replicating ways of ministry that maybe just don't work the same way. And then, the other side of that is sometimes we have great turnout and kids love our youth group. I mean, in our research, we visited one church where the girls in a small group would text each other messages like, we just have to get to youth group. We just have to make it to youth group. Their youth ministry was really a refuge in some powerful ways. But it did leave us wondering, well, what about the rest of the week? How do we help teenagers live their faith all through the week? And then also, what about after our youth ministry? What about the rest of their lives? And in some ways that ties back to some of the questions we were asking here at the Fuller Youth Institute, 15 or so years ago, when we were working on this question of, what became sticky faith, which a lot of folks are familiar with who've been tracking with us over time. But it started with this question of, what can we do in high school that will help faith last beyond high school? And then we started driving that further down. What can we do in middle school and elementary and in families and in our ministries? And I think in some ways, Faith Beyond Youth Group kind of brings that question and that circle or that conversation kind of full circle. So I'm really excited about having this conversation in 2023, where literally everything has changed since I started ministry.
Yeah, no, and I mean, and it is something that, I mean, I started youth ministry in 2010, and so even looking at the past decade of youth ministry, I agree with the whole comments of like, there are some things where it's like, I can do this exactly like I did when I started it, but there are so many things, for lack of a better word, they're not really that different. They're rebranded. And so these same issues arise, these same issues come up, and we see all these different things. And nowadays you hear a lot about church dropouts, you hear about deconstruction, you hear about all these big terminology words, or I think the other one was nuns or something like that, which there's all kinds of terminology now. But as y'all researched this, what surprised you about character forming discipleship in light of all this? Because we've had different youth pastors on this. We've had people, also big name speakers or like directors and stuff like that. We had Shane Pruitt on, and he talked about the statistics of like 70s, I think it was high 70s, low 80s of people accept Christ by the time they're 18, which is mind blowing. But then we also look at the statistic that's out that says like 70% are dropping in college. And so it's really, really scary when you look at these statistics. And so how did y'all come about doing this research? What surprised you? Just what stood out the most?
Yeah. Well, I think it's unsurprising to most of us. We hear a lot, as you said, about people leaving the church, young people leaving the church specifically. Those statistics can be kind of hard to put our finger on, but without a doubt, there's a lot of church hurt out there. And we do hear that. We hear that term deconstruction thrown around. It means a lot of different things, but it often means I'm rethinking my faith, and usually outside of the church. And so as we interviewed and surveyed and talked to youth leaders from across the country in our research, and we went to visit churches in person, what was interesting, we certainly heard about that part of the story. And we also we were surprised about other parts of the story. So a lot of just intentionality, really intentional ways that churches are faithfully going about youth discipleship. And that is often, it's slow, it's patient discipleship, it's resilient ministry in the face of, a lot of changes. And we began to talk about this kind of discipleship as Faith Beyond Youth Group. And we unpack that in the book as Jesus-centered character that matters every day. So Jesus-centered character that matters every day. And we really think young people want a faith that demonstrates not only that Christianity is true, which sometimes we really hammer, but that Christianity is good, that it matters, right? And that it matters to other people and is appealing in the ways that we actually live our lives, not just the things that we shout at the world. And so that was something that, I think if we were surprised and encouraged, it was so much of this is about simple, patient, slow ministry more than it is about big, showy ministry. I think it's also about remembering and naming what's really good about youth ministry. We say youth ministry is centered in relationships. I think the best of us, the best of what we do in student ministry is so relational, and yet there's something that's different about doing relational ministry today than it was maybe even just a few years ago. And those are the pieces we really wanted to dig in on.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the whole term relational changed post 2020, 2019 with the whole pandemic, because I mean, relational changed. Like we almost, and I don't know how long this will last, but we value relationship again. I would argue that we, right before this whole pandemic happened, we were getting to the point to where relational was kind of getting watered down. We had a lot of opportunities for relationships, but none of them really seemed beneficial until we got stuck where it was virtual relationships only and we couldn't do anything for months. And so I totally agree. But you mentioned character and the whole Jesus-centered character, and I think that's a really, really great approach to do. But one of the things that also, I guess, can kind of come in a negative light is character is kind of a surprisingly loaded term. And so we hear about moral, we hear about character failing, we hear about pastors and big names, for lack of better words, in Christianity that are falling due to character and all these things. And so, how do these stories of good or bad character, how are they impacting young people, as the students that we're serving on a regular basis? And then how do we deal, or how does your research, I guess, more or likely, suggest that we deal with such failure? Because it's hard to walk into a room where teenagers are like, hey, you messed up. Or you have this pastor that might have done something, or they have parents that have had this moral failure. It's a hard road to navigate. So what does your research kind of lead us in the direction of, I guess, solving that with?
Yeah. Well, we do hear the stories. And as you said, young people hear them often before us. Like, character failure is all over the place. It's all over the news. And it is up close and personal for a lot of young people. And so that, combined with character itself, can be such a loaded term. It comes with baggage, maybe how character was used to get us to conform to, certain behaviors. Character it's just tied inseparably to morality. And so that's a piece of this that's just real, right? And the word itself, sometimes it sounds kind of dated, like something our grandmothers care about, but maybe irrelevant now. Or, I mean, my tradition, I come from a holiness tradition. And so even that language of holiness, it can sound like behaving. And it can sound like being good kids. And making sure that we graduate kids from high school who are nice, successful virgins. And that's what we care about the most. And so in some ways, we've got to turn the dial a little bit, that when we're talking about character, we mean something a little different. So we did dig into scripture. We dug into social science research. Our definition of character, where we landed, was Jesus' goodness, or living out Jesus' goodness every day by loving God and our neighbors. So the living out Jesus' goodness part is that we're modeling our own character after the character of Christ. That God's very character is worth modeling, is worth, Jesus is not only worth following, but worth being like. I mean, we say Christ-like, we use that term in ministry, and that's exactly what we mean, that we live out Jesus' own goodness, his character, and that's an everyday kind of thing. And that the second part of that is by loving God and our neighbors. And so Jesus' greatest commandment is tied up in that too. What did he ask of us? That we would love God and love people. And it turns out that's pretty hard to do, right? And it's hard to do consistently. And we have Jesus' very own model of what that looks like. And so we make a distinction really between that and trying to get teenagers to be, quote, good kids, that we're not just trying to make good kids or nice kids. We want to form disciples with the character of Christ. And that's not quite the same thing. And so to tie that with the other part of that question, they see plenty of counterexamples all the time. And sometimes in our churches and, certainly in public leaders. And so those kind of stories and encounters, they do foster distrust. There's a distrust that young people already feel towards the church, kind of by and large in our culture. And that sort of hypocrisy that's preaching one thing, living another. I think that one of the things we can do to respond to that is to cultivate the kind of environment where church is the first place students think about when they run into these stories, that they can think like, I can talk about this at church. And even when it happens in our own church, that we can actually talk about this at church. We can engage it. We can wonder about it. We can wonder what we can learn and how our faith can compel us to respond differently or to live in our own lives in a different way. And it gives us reminders too that, following Jesus is not something that any of us do perfectly, that's not the point, but cultivating the kind of character that is consistent, it makes a big difference. It makes a big difference if you live, if you're who you say you are, not just here, but elsewhere.
Did y'all see any, I guess, obviously what I jumped to with character is with character, with the moral failings and everything else. I mean, the big, I guess, cultural term right now is cancel culture. Did you see that play into any effect in your research on like the current cultural trend of like, if they do wrong, we're just going to shut them out? Or does that play into any regards?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say, I don't know that we explore that really specifically, but I do think that's a great question for us to raise with students.
Sure.
Of, well, what should we do, when we encounter somebody who's inconsistent? What should we do when somebody messes up? What is actually a Christian response to that? Is it just to shout about their hypocrisy? Is it to, do we explore? I mean, some of that too depends on how personal it is for us. Like, what does it look like to walk towards forgiving someone? Is there a difference if they're repentant or not? If they're willing to talk honestly about what happened or not? What does that look like? What does repair look like? What does reconciliation look like? Or restoring people? I think there are certainly examples of church communities that do a good job of walking with people through restoration, and we can hold that up as well.
Yeah.
But I think it's fair for us to press on cancel culture a little bit with young people and even ask, like, when something happens, do you tend to just write somebody off altogether? I think that can help us to address some of that, the polarization that we tend towards right now, where everything feels very one-sided or another-sided and without much in between.
Sure. And the reason I ask that is because, especially nowadays, I know that there's a lot of youth pastors out there that feel like they have to, I guess, like you said, we have to press against this cancel culture mindset, because in all reality, that's one of the most anti-gospel things out there, because Jesus doesn't cancel anybody outside of the people that are trying to be overly religious, or the ones that are trying to like push all these laws like Pharisees or anything like that. And he pushes and challenges them. But when it comes to everybody else, that's the failures that have all these character flaws and everything else, he brings grace, like you said, he brings restoration, he brings hope. And so I think a lot of times youth leaders are going and they're doing this, they're doing this like almost frontline effort of trying to battle this cultural movement, And a lot of times I think that there's burnout happening there because they see the students have all these right answers. They have the right answers in youth group, but like you said with the girls, they're like, we just have to make it to Friday night youth group. It's like, well, what happens when they're doing this on Friday night youth group and they have all the answers, but then you see them doing something completely different? So I think a lot of youth pastors are seeing this burnout. And in many cases, it's because they feel like they have very, very little impact. So obviously, especially post 2020, burnout rates for anybody in ministry are at an all-time high. Um, how did burnout and like studying and looking into researching burnout over the last 3 years come into play with this? You might know a story that specifically stood out or anything during your research, but how does that come into play with your research? And how would something like this Jesus-centered character worked towards helping those moments to where the youth pastor might feel ineffective, or the youth pastor might feel like they have little to no impact with the kids that they're trying to do this with?
Yeah. Yeah, and that's a common story. We hear a lot from leaders, things like, I'm so tired, nobody cares about what I'm doing, our kids aren't coming anymore. In our research, I remember one story of a leader who he talked about scrolling on social media and seeing one of his students, committed student out at a wild party, lifting up that red Solo cup. And he said, that was pretty discouraging. And you just wonder in those moments, like, what, am I making any impact at all? What difference does this make? And that is a real factor in burnout. Research shows that burnout can be the result of working too much, but it can also be a result of seeing too little impact. When we feel like we're not making a real difference. And that's the kind of thing we hear from leaders. And as you said, other research, backs that up. Barna has been following this, and Youth Cartel put out a study that over 30% of youth leaders felt like leaving ministry in the past year. Barna's was somewhere around 40% of pastors felt like leaving ministry in the past year. I think that's really... It just elevates that this is something that a lot of us are wrestling with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's, I guess, in the midst of that, part of what we tried to develop out of our research was something hopeful for leaders. And we really hope that it can be a hopeful guide. In fact, we use the image of a compass as we tried to think about how would a student pastor, a ministry leader actually take this and use it in their ministry. And we thought about compass, this idea, not a checklist, not a linear process, but actually a navigational tool, something that we can use to orient ourselves in ministry to try to get to a destination. And, I think that destination is about seeing more Christ-like character in our students' lives. And I think that can sort of work against burnout, I guess, would be a way to say that.
Sure. And I think one of the big things that we talked about character, and we talked about burnout from feeling less impact. And I think something that has to be in this conversation is, whether you started youth ministry in the 70s or the 90s or 2000s, whatever, trust is a super, super important aspect. And so with that, though, we can't develop relationships without it. And so are we seeing different trends when it comes to trust on youth ministry, like trusting their youth pastor or anything like that with Gen Z? Is that different? And if so, how can we better foster relationships with Gen Z specifically? And what makes this generation, I guess, outside of the pandemic, obviously, what makes this generation different than previous generations?
Trust is no longer a given. That is, I think, the biggest difference, is that trust is no longer a given. So a number of studies show that trust levels drop by generation, and that today's younger generations trust others less and trust institutions less than ever. And, and part of what's interesting there is that they trust influencers more than institutions. It's kind of a TikTok world of authority and answers, and young people are used to hearing from lots of different voices, choosing what sounds right to them from among all that's out there, right? And that is, I think, a unique kind of challenge of what we're facing when it comes to trust right now. Another way that we've thought about this is, those of us who've been in ministry a while, it may have been true a decade or more ago that if a kid liked you, they probably trusted you. And we sort of think about kind of cultivating this sense of rapport, and maybe we are fun to be around, or we do some things that, kids kind of like us. And I think the opposite is now true, that a kid might actually like us, but not trust us. That it takes a lot longer to cultivate that trust because there's more barriers. And, this is why cultivating trust is actually the first compass point. And we think while these don't necessarily go in exact order, it's really, really important to start with trust. And what I love about that too, as a longtime youth worker, is that cultivating trust can help ministries leverage the relational strengths they already have to go even deeper. And it requires us it requires closeness, like relational proximity with young people. It requires being in their spaces, showing up. And it also requires some consistency. So consistency is our relational longevity. It's being around over time. It is showing up week after week. I mean, for our volunteers, it's being consistent to fulfill their commitments to work with young people. For all of us, it's things like, if I say I'm going to show up at that band competition, then I need to show up. And, if I don't, I need to reach out because I might be breaking trust. So, trust is built in little ways. It's a little ways. And consistency over time. One volunteer in our research comes to mind. He goes by Slick. He's 71 years old. He's a youth group volunteer. That's awesome. We love these guys, right?
Yeah.
And he just, he didn't necessarily use these words, but the pattern that we heard him talk about over and over was just showing up in small everyday acts of loving young people unconditionally and just showing up in their lives. And one quote that I will never forget is, he said, "I like to think if Jesus walked the earth today, he'd spend a lot of time at 7th grade tennis matches." And I think that's just exactly it right there.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's, man, what a quote. We could almost do an entire podcast on like just unraveling that one quote right there. But yeah, I think, like you said, even going back, I was in youth early 2000s. I don't remember ever not trusting my youth pastor. And like you said, like the whole trust not being a given anymore is, I mean, I have to say it's discouraging because it is. But at the same time, it's almost more of a challenge and more of like a get up and like go earn their trust then and do a good job. And so I think that for the youth pastors listening to this, that should be at the forefront. But as you mentioned, this is only one of the 5, correct? You had 5 compass points. And yes. So we go from cultivating trust to your next one, which modeling growth would be that. And so modeling growth is one way that adults can have really big impact on students, where we live in a world where a person's character or their private life doesn't always match up with what we see, or it gets exposed like we talked about with the cancel culture and everything else. How do youth leaders, or how can youth leaders do more to model integrity and virtue?
Mm-hmm. It really does start with us. And this is maybe the hard truth. Who we are models what it means to follow Jesus. And teenagers see it. They see our character gaps. They see if we are people who stretch the truth, ignore the rules. They're watching for what our everyday actions reveal beyond our words, beyond what we say when we're up in front, or, teaching the Bible or whatever it is that we're doing. And that doesn't mean that we have to be perfect. Of course, that's impossible. The point here is be authentically you and authentically imperfect. So when you make a mistake, you own it. You acknowledge what went wrong. If you need to ask for forgiveness, you ask for forgiveness. You make things right. That it's really important to model for young people to see mistakes and also to see repair. To see people trying to live out their faith. What was so interesting to us, so in our site visits around the country, we sat down with students as well. A lot of this research was talking with youth leaders, but we did talk with students. And it was really interesting how consistently when we were asking students about leaders and what they appreciated or valued, it was surprising how much they talked about that they really like hearing stories about their leaders' struggles.
Yeah.
So, we need to be appropriate in this and appropriately vulnerable, but like stories that showcase our failures, they go a long way with young people. And because it helps them see that like we model also that it's safe to fail and it's safe to talk about it, and it's good to grow from that and all of that. And so that modeling, it extends into, not just how we're modeling being people who follow Jesus consistently, but we're also modeling growth. We're modeling, well, this didn't go right, or I really struggled with that, or whatever. And then also here's how my life is growing and changing.
Sure.
And that makes space for students' doubts and their questions. And that's so critical to faith formation.
Yeah, well, and I think authenticity is one of the biggest things that we can do is when we show them that we are not above them or on this like unattainable level, but when we allow ourselves to be in the same trench as they are, when we allow them to see the same struggles or the struggles that we have done and overcome, it just opens up so many doors and opportunities. And I've actually had a student in my ministry bring that up, and they said, I love when you tell stories like this because it makes you feel human.
Yeah.
And it was like, well, at first I kind of laughed it off, but then I started thinking about it and I was like, that's so true. Because there's so many people, and this isn't just a youth thing. This is adults, this is children. Yeah. They look at the pastors in the church and they see them on this pedestal, and it's not a new issue. It's not something new, because pastors have kind of always been revered in their communities, unless that moral failure or something to that nature happens. But they've always kind of been given the benefit of the doubt and that kind of unquestionable trust just by their status, because they're the pastor. Like they're for a really cheesy way to say it, they're better than we are. Right. And it's such a bad way to present ourselves in ministry, because we want faith to seem like something that they can attain themselves. Mm-hmm. And if we are allowing ourselves to be on that pedestal that's above them, then what kind of gospel is that when we are not allowing them to be able to reach and see our mistakes and see our failures, like you said? So there was one quote that really, really stood out to me, though. And it was, I don't know if I've heard this before, but it said, character is caught before it's taught. So I guess unravel that for a second, but then also, like, do you have examples on this? Because that's like a proverb. Like that's a good quote.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. And that comes out of the literature some, as well. And others who have been kind of leaning into this idea of, we didn't originate the phrase of it's caught before it's taught, but we did kind of latch on to it. There are a lot of character education programs out there. They're often used in schools, often at younger ages. There's character curriculum, even for youth ministries, and that's not a bad thing. But the way character is actually formed in us is more complicated than just taking in information, So we can't just teach Christ-like character. One of the most likely ways we learn it, and this is because of how we are built neurologically, is we catch it. We see it. We see it in someone else's example. This is interesting too, because research would say some of this is examples that can be far away. So we're inspired by models, people like Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., like those sort of exemplar models. They do inspire us, and like we can catch character by really seeing how someone like that has lived. But most of our models are much closer to home. It's the grandmother who takes in her grandkids and raises them. It's the parent who chooses to do the right thing, even though it's hard or inconvenient, and the kid sees that. It's the local business leader who gives back generously to the community. Like, these are examples that it's not just that we see them, it's because it's that they actually become part of us. Like, they impact how we act in the future because we want to be like someone like that. And I want to say too, to student ministry leaders, I think this is where partnering with parents in youth ministry and the intergenerational church is so important.
Yeah.
Parents, because they just have more time with their kids, period. And, parents intuitively know they're like setting an example for their kids. Of course, parents hear that usually in a shame-based kind of way, but they might need help seeing that their complicated everyday lives are the testimony they're offering to their kids. Way that I actually respond to my kids or my spouse or my neighbor, the way do I respond to a need in our community or the world, like that's actually what my kids are picking up about what it means to live as a person who's following Jesus right now. And that is much more in the nitty-gritty of life. It is much more about, seeing, again, the very real models in front of us. And sometimes to get outside of our family, this is also why we need a lot of different kinds of volunteers in youth ministry, why we need adults in our church who come share their stories with students. Because I think they see through those stories a lot of examples of what it looks like to just try to live faithfully. And that along the way, students catch that. They catch what that looks like, and they can then put that in action in their own lives.
Yeah. I totally agree with the parents setting the example. That's such a great thought. And the thing is like, I think there's a lot of teenagers out there that would be like, oh, mom, like, why do you come with me? Kind of thing like that. But then there's the other side of it, to where the best friend that doesn't have the same parent relationship at home sees mom as an active member, an active volunteer within the youth program. And they're like, dude, I think it's so cool that your mom's a part of this. Like, I would give anything for my mom to care that much. And it works from a 2-point scenario, because first off, like, you have the friend that is just like, I want to do this when I get older. Like, I see the value and I see the importance because I don't have it right now. And then you have the other side of it from the kid that's like, oh, well, yeah, I guess my parents are pretty cool, kind of thing like that. And they kind of have this realization that they can't avoid because it's their friends telling them, like, I wish I had your parents. So it's really, really cool to see, because, man, what an impact. And then you talked about bringing church people in. We're in the middle or getting closer to the end. I teach high school in my student ministry. For the last 4 weeks, I have not taught. I've had college kids from different universities in our town come in, and they've been doing a series. And last night, we had a girl come in. She's pretty active in our college ministry. She's pretty active on her campus. And she came in and talked last night. And I have a youth right now that's heard, I mean, for lack of better words, she's about to lose a parent due to cancer. And she was having a hard time last night. And the girl that came in to speak was like, hey, what's wrong? She doesn't seem okay. And someone mentioned, well, her dad's about to die of cancer. And she was like, my dad died 3 months ago of cancer.
Oh, wow.
And so she was like, what, do you think it'd be awkward if I went and talked to her?
Hmm.
And so when you allow other people to come into your group, you have those moments where God just kind of goes and like draws people together that you would have never yourself had the connection to do. And so there's so many different things that can come with that. So love the idea of character, taught before caught. Such a um, great thing to put together. You have a couple others, and we've talked about a little bit, but what Gen Z is kind of how they're set apart, for lack of a better term, from other generations. How can we take that knowledge and apply it to our interactions with the teenagers that we have right now? And then how can we teach in ways that actually lead towards transformation? Because we talked a little bit earlier about the burnout of having that little impact or feeling like they have that little impact. And a lot of people that work in ministry can be disappointed because we might be the planter or we might be the waterer, but there's hardly any time that we get to see the harvest. And so how do we work through that? How can we teach in ways that can actually lead towards transformation?
Yeah, that's good. And with Gen Z, we talked about this trust gap, and I would add to that we use three descriptors for this generation of that they're anxious, adaptive, and diverse. And anxious is a way they describe their generation. Certainly, mental health is more kind of on the it's more in the like in the language, in the dialogue. It's in the water, so to speak. Adaptive is just who they've had to be. This was true before the pandemic and even more so after the pandemic, even just the way technology is constantly adapting. And then diverse in a lot of ways, but in particular, racially and ethnically, those under 18. We crossed a line in 2020 where half of those under 18 are young people of color. And so in the midst of all of that, they're growing up in this age that is, if you put all that together, it's pretty pluralistic and ambiguous and confusing on top of the normal confusion of adolescence. So I think that when we think about that in our teaching, that when we come in with these sort of cut and dried, here are the 3 points. They all have right answers. All my questions have right answers. And here are the right answers. And we sort of see teaching as this exercise in information transfer. We really are missing the opportunity to engage them in a way that can lead to transformation. And so the way we can flip that is really questions, teaching through questions. We say never make a statement if you can ask a question instead, because teenagers need that space, both to ask their questions and to wrestle with questions, with ideas and beliefs and Bible passages in ways that make room for curiosity, that make room for even doubt, that make room for them to go on a journey to where faith can really become something that they understand and claim for themselves and that they integrate into their lives. When we use questions, we are following Jesus' approach. He was 40 times more likely to ask a question than give an answer. He really walked with people. He walked with people at their pace. And I think for us in leadership, it pushes us to go past the model of just giving a talk, but to think really creatively and experientially about how we teach as well, facilitating experiences, all that sort of thing. So, I think it's, we could probably go on forever and ever about, teaching approaches. But we just have to get out of the box of my job here is to make sure that these young people get this information and have these right beliefs and believe these specific truths by the time we get done with this session. I think that is a set of goals that, it's really hard to obtain those goals if you've ever spent time with teenagers and B, it might not be what's actually good for them, right? Like they may claim that truth for themselves and understand it as God's truth. But that journey, that might take weeks or months or years for them to get to that point. And
Yeah.
just because they can regurgitate a fact to us or a belief statement to us, that has nothing to do with whether it's transformed them.
Sure. No, I mean very much, and I think yeah, the whole questions mindset is super super important because I don't think there's any greater development in your faith than tackling questions. When you have that opportunity to explore those things that you're not quite sure on, and like you said, the safe space to do that. There's nothing more formative and transformative when it comes to that, and that's awesome. So the last 2 points of the compass are practice together and making meaning. And so, what are some of the events or circumstances that young people need to make meaning from? And how can we help them do this, particularly by practicing together, kind of throwing those two in at the end? How do
Yeah.
they work together? Like, how do we use those in a way that helps students?
Yeah, these two compass points, they really do play off each other. So practicing together, it can be anything that gives teenagers the tools they need to put their faith into action in everyday lives. And that could be practicing in our actual, youth group context, or it could be something they go out and practice and they come back. So everyday life is full of lots of opportunities to practice and to make meaning. And some of those moments, they kind of bubble to the top. So, you get cut from the team, or you land the lead role in the musical. You break up with the boyfriend. You're sorting through college rejection letters. Like, that stuff feels really big to a
Sure.
teenager. And those are the kind of moments that we can step in and walk alongside them as they walk through and help them make meaning of what happened. And then there's also like those events in our community or our country or our world that just shake kids up. Whether
Yeah.
that's a mass shooting, a natural disaster, we could go on and on. But whatever's going on in the news, you can bet that that's filtering through some of their social media feeds for sure.
Yeah.
And that it's in their mind. And so processing, making meaning, that can look like, really processing with them what happened, whether that was something that happened to them or out there in the world. What could it mean? That we kind of dive into what's going on here. How do we make sense of this? Or how do we make meaning out of it? And then the what next? What might God be inviting us into or you into here? What could God be doing in the midst of this? And helping them identify one next step. So that's where it kind of cycles back to practicing. Is there something you could try or do, a conversation you could have, something you could sit with that's just like one next step? And so we walk through that at whatever level is appropriate to the teenagers in front of us. But that is really how we tap into our pastoral vocation of making meaning with people, of helping people make, as our colleague Scott Cormode would say here at Fuller, make spiritual sense of their
Yep.
lives. We're helping them name things. We're helping them connect that to the larger biblical narrative, to God's story and how God's story is interacting with where we are. And that's like that integrative work. I got to tell you, I'm somebody who I just eat that up. I love that part. And so much so that, it can be annoying because I'm always wanting to do that. But it can be really simple. And honestly, even some of the things we do that are a little bit they seem kind of trite or like youth ministry hacks. Like we heard from one group of kids who talked about, we went on a retreat and we made masks and we wore them. And then we heard this talk. And then at the end, we took the masks off and we ripped them up and threw them in a fire and everybody was crying. And on one hand, you're like, oh, okay, that's like a very classic youth ministry thing. On the other hand, there's symbolism like that where we help them make meaning. Taking rocks and building altars, washing our hands in water and there's so much water imagery. So this is where Christian and biblical symbolism and these kind of hands-on use of symbols, that can also be a really powerful way that we actively make meaning with students. So it's kind of all of that stuff. It's helping them then go back into the everyday and live a little differently because of how we made meaning together. You're muted.
Yeah, that happens. Yeah. So, with that being said, again, awesome book. I love kind of how I think the compass is a really cool aspect to kind of I piece all of these pieces together, because like you said, there's really not a particular way that works better than other, but like what a directional tool and a directional focus of, like, hey, like you said just a second ago in a different format, but like, here's the next step, we're going in this direction, but you have to know which way to go. And so using this in a compass format's really, really cool. And so you kind of end the book with a chapter that's called Your Own Map. And so my question kind of off of that is, like, how do youth pastors get started with this? How do youth ministry leaders get started? And how can they implement this new compass mentality in their ministries?
It really starts by listening well and defining reality in your own context. So, we really believe as researchers what matters most in assessing youth ministry, it's not really what we adults think, but what teenagers think and experience. And so that is part of what we really encourage in that last chapter. There's a series of questions, and you can answer them yourself, with your team. We really encourage getting students' perspectives too, and even parents' perspectives, to get a sense for, like, where are we right now? Where are we already kind of strong and we can build on those strengths when it comes to these compass points, and where might we need to focus on improvement? And, for example, like, maybe we're doing really great at cultivating trust, but our teaching is not very transformative. Or maybe we have these incredible models of growth, but we're kind of skipping out on making meaning. So most of us, we can't have 5 starting places.
Yeah.
We need one starting place. And so that listening and assessment can help us figure out, okay, where's the place where we want to focus and start coming up with and implementing some new ideas. So with that, we really think anybody can do this. Like, we think character forming discipleship works anywhere, any size ministry or budget or facility or whatever else. It just really harnesses the power of relationships to do this, to cultivate trust and model faith and teach for transformation and practice together and make meaning.
Yeah. And I think it's a great roadmap. And like you said, you have to start somewhere. Maybe you have one of these down really, really well, and you're kind of looking for that next step, or maybe you're looking for the complete revamp or like the complete reevaluation of how you're doing things. Either way, what a great tool to have. What a great resource for youth pastors. And then honestly, I could see we've had a couple different episodes now where we've talked about the importance of networking and getting together with your local youth pastors. What a book study. Like, this would be a great book to use as a book study and just evaluate your ministry with your peers and say, man, I'm really struggling in this part. Because not only are you going to show that authenticity to other youth pastors that are probably like, I'm struggling too, but then you also might have the wisdom and the experience of other youth pastors in your group that are like, hey, I'm not struggling with that point, I'm struggling with a different one, but I can help you kind of walk through this, and we can get you on a path where you can get better and work at this as well.
I love that. Yeah.
So lastly with that though, in order for that to happen, we have to know where we can find this book. And so where can people go to get their hands on a copy of Faith Beyond Youth Group?
Yeah, thanks for that. Books are available everywhere now, but faithbeyondyouthgroup.com is a great starting place. And so at faithbeyondyouthgroup.com, we do have links to all the places you can buy the book, including from Fuller Youth Institute directly. We also have some other free content there, and I would just encourage you to check out what else is available and other blog posts on our site and that kind of thing.
Awesome. And then finally, what we ask for all of our guests, if someone wants to reach out and ask you a question or talk to you specifically, what is the best way for people to reach you? And how can people go about contacting you if they have more questions or want more information?
Yeah, that's great. These days I'm most active on Instagram. So at bgriffin, FYI. would be a great place to reach out, and I'd love to hear from you.
It took me a second. You said B. Griffin, FYI, and I was like, for your information, what? But Fuller Youth Institute. Yeah, I got it. So if you are slow like I am today, FYI is Fuller Youth Institute, like Brad said, where he does work. And man, Brad, I thank you for your work in this. You and Jen and Kara do some fantastic work. And like we said at the beginning of this, what a great book to have. And this seems like one of those books. I often reference Doug Field's First 2 Years in Youth Ministry as like one of those like fireplace books where like you can pick it up every couple of years and you need to go back through it and you need to reevaluate and rethink through and just kind of use it as a checklist of like, am I really doing this right? Or like, where have I kind of fallen off the wagon? I can see this as just like that in regards to, is this something that is going to be able where I can pick it up every 2 years and say, am I still on the right track? Do I need to reevaluate my compass? Kind of thing like that. So fantastic. Love watching what you and Fuller Youth are doing. We can't wait to see what's next. Thank you for coming on the show. And if you are listening to us, that is all we have for the show. If you're a frequent listener of our podcast, all we ask is that you do your part to get our podcast out to the greater student ministry audience. Share our podcast with your youth pastor friends on social media, or tag a specific episode that really stood out to you, like this one maybe. Either way, be sure to tag us in the post on your favorite platform by using @TalkStudentMen. Finally, if you'd like to be like Brad and be on the show in the future, you can reach out to us on social media or send us an email, podcast@studentministryconversations.org, and we'd love to set up a time where you can come on the show with us. But as always, Brad, it's an honor to have you. Super grateful for your years in ministry, your years in the trenches doing research. So hopefully youth pastors can find a way to do ministry and share life with students even better. And I think this is a great addition to my bookshelf. I'm looking forward to finishing this book because I hadn't quite got through it, but I'm a super slow reader. So I don't know. There might be some credibility in that savoring
That's
as
good.
I read or something to that nature.
I love it. Thank you.
Thank you for all your contributions to youth ministry, and for everybody listening to this, thank you for listening to this episode, and we will see you guys next week.